If you ever pictured a medieval tavern, chances are the image comes straight out of a movie. A bard strumming a lute in the corner, a group of adventurers laughing over foaming mugs of beer, and a chubby innkeeper wiping glasses with a suspiciously dirty rag. Well, let me tell you, you're only half right. Those images aren't completely false, but the reality of medieval taverns was far more, let's say, earthy. And by earthy, I mean they smelled of sweat, sour ale, and something you probably didn't want to identify. So, let's step inside a tavern. Not the Hollywood version, but the real thing, with a touch of humor, so you don't fall asleep while we wade through the smells, smoke, and grit of the Middle Ages. First, what exactly was a tavern in medieval times? They weren't modern bars with menus or cozy pubs with clever names. Taverns were rough establishments where people went to drink, eat whatever scraps were available, and socialize, or, more often than not, get into trouble. They were the meeting point for travelers, merchants, peasants, and occasionally even a noble who either lost his way or wanted to blend in with the common folk. But don't imagine a charming place with a painted sign reading the Laughing Dragon Tavern. Most taverns were little more than large houses with a common room where the owner served whatever he had on hand. If there was a sign at all, it was usually a crudely painted board, the kind of artwork that looked like it was done by a 5-year-old. Many taverns didn't bother with a sign at all. Locals simply knew that, say, at William the Fat's house, you could get a decent brew, and that was enough. In bigger towns, taverns might have practical names like the Horn or the Jug, but they were more about function than poetry. Inside, the atmosphere was far from cozy. Forget warm candlelight and hearth fires glowing cheerfully. Illumination came from tallow candles that reeked of burnt animal fat, or from a fireplace that filled the entire room with smoke. Ventilation was not exactly a priority. Tallow candles, by the way, were made from animal fat, and if they weren't properly processed, the stench would be strong enough to make you reconsider staying. Windows, if they existed, were small and often covered with cloth or leather instead of glass. Glass was a luxury for churches and the wealthy, not for taverns. So you walk into a dark, smoky room with a smell that was a cocktail of unwashed humanity, spilled beer, and, oh yes, animals. Chickens, dogs, sometimes even a stray pig might wander in. In winter, icy drafts slipped through every crack. In summer, the heat and lack of air circulation made the place suffocating. Romantic, right? If you were lucky, the tavern keeper cracked open a window, but that just meant flies could get in. Or worse, the smell of the street drifted inside, and medieval streets weren't exactly rose gardens. Think manure and garbage piled up outside. Now, let's talk about the drinks. Because when you think tavern, you think beer. And yes, beer was the reigning queen. But not the crisp, golden craft IPA you might imagine. Medieval beer, called ale, was cloudy, heavy, and its flavor ranged from decent to distaste like a wet sock. It didn't contain hops, since hops only became common in the later Middle Ages. Instead, it was sweetened or flavored with herbs like rosemary, sage, or even nettles, often to cover up the fact that it had already gone bad. Fermentation was a hit-or-miss process, using wild yeast or even leftover dough from bread. That meant every barrel was a gamble. Sometimes the ale turned out drinkable. Other times it was so sour only the bravest or the drunkest could finish it. And it wasn't always strong. In fact, there was a lighter version called small ale, which even children drank because water wasn't safe. Picture an 8-year-old with his own pint of beer light while doing chores. It sounds shocking today, but in those days, small ale was more hydration than intoxication. Wine existed too, but it wasn't the star of the tavern table. In places like France or Italy, wine was more common, but in England or Germany it was expensive and often terrible. Imported wine arrived in barrels that had survived rough travel by ship or cart, so it was often spoiled. At best, it tasted watered down, at worst, like sour vinegar with a hint of mold. And forget elegant glasses. Wine was served in clay jugs, horns, or wooden cups that had already been used by several people before you. Hygiene wasn't high on the list. If they did rinse the cups, it was with a quick dunk in a communal bucket of water that, by dinner time, looked more like soup. And the food? Let's just say, if you're expecting a menu with roasted ribs and honey glaze or spiced pumpkin soup, you'll be disappointed. The food in taverns was basic. And by basic, I mean yesterday's leftovers, if you're lucky. The star dish was usually a stew, thrown together with whatever ingredients were at hand. Some meat, if fortune smiled, maybe lamb or chicken. Other times it was rabbit or something less identifiable. Vegetables like turnips, cabbages, leeks, and plenty of barley or oats to bulk it up. Cooked in a big cauldron hanging over the fire, constantly refilled. The stew's flavor changed daily, not always for the better. Bread was another staple, but don't picture fresh baguettes. It was dark, hard, and often made from mixed flours, rye, peas, whatever was cheapest. If you got fresh bread, you were lucky. If not, you had to soak it in the stew just to chew it. Cheese or butter were occasional treats, and dessert didn't really exist. If you craved something sweet, it was an apple, some berries, or honey smeared on bread. And forget forks. They weren't common yet. You ate with your hands or with a wooden spoon you brought yourself. Imagine trying to court someone while both of you reached into the same stew with your fingers. Pure romance. The furniture inside taverns wasn't much to brag about either. Tables were rough-hewn wood, scarred with cuts, stains, and who knows what from countless customers. Seating meant benches or stools, often so wobbly that one wrong move or one too many mugs of ale could send you tumbling to the floor. If you wanted comfort, you brought your own cushion. Cleanliness? Let's call it relative. Floors were covered with straw or rushes meant to soak up spills, but they also soaked up everything else. Beer, vomit, dog urine, and worse. Changing the straw happened only when someone remembered, which could mean weeks or even months. Drop your bread on the floor, and the 5-second rule could turn into a gamble with your life. Walls were plain wood, mud, or stone. Decoration was rare. Maybe a tool or animal skin hung on the wall, or in a fancier tavern, a tattered tapestry long past its prime. Now, let's talk about the people. Taverns were social melting pots, but not in the cheerful sense you imagine. Here you'd find peasants exhausted from a day in the fields, merchants negotiating deals, travelers looking for a bed, and yes, shady characters scheming about stolen horses or contraband. Women did frequent taverns, though not always without judgment. Many worked there as servers, cleaners, or cooks, while others, let's say, offered additional services in the back or upstairs. Not every tavern was a brothel, but the line was often blurry. In cities, taverns sometimes drew prostitutes, which only worsened their reputation in the eyes of the church and authorities. Still, some women, wives of merchants or widows managing family businesses, ran or visited taverns without scandal. Power often silenced gossip. And then there were the drunks. Yes, people got drunk, and not the cheerful, singing in harmony kind of drunk from the movies. Real tavern drunkenness often turned ugly. Fights were common, and they weren't neatly choreographed bar brawls. A fight could end with a broken stool over someone's head, a missing tooth, or, if knives got involved and many carried them, a wound serious enough to send you to the local barber surgeon. And he wasn't much better than the village butcher. Fights broke out for almost anything. A careless insult, unpaid debt, or simply someone staring too long. Authorities distrusted taverns for this very reason. Many towns imposed laws limiting opening hours, banning weapons inside, or holding tavern keepers responsible for keeping order. But rules were enforced only when the sheriff felt like it. Sometimes the tavern keeper himself had to break up fights, swinging a stick or throwing the combatants into the street. And let's clear up a myth. The bard. Movies love to show a troubadour serenading patrons every night. In truth, music wasn't the norm. Wandering musicians existed, but they weren't fixtures in every tavern. If there was music, it was more likely a half-drunk man bawling out a bawdy song, a group of customers trying to remember lyrics, or someone banging a drum until everyone begged him to stop. The instruments? Simple flutes, bagpipes, or small drums. And if a bard did appear, he wasn't a handsome elf with a golden voice. He was usually a scruffy wanderer in patch clothes, hoping for few coins or free drink. Entertainment was simpler. Gossip, dice games, often illegal because gambling was frowned upon by the church, or makeshift board games with rules no one truly understood and that usually ended in arguments anyway. As for the tavern keeper himself, forget the smiling, jovial figure. Many were just business owners trying to survive, not patient hosts. Some were notorious for watering down ale, serving food past its prime, or overcharging clueless travelers who had no chance of coming back to complain. Others, though, earned the respect of their communities. A good tavern keeper could make his tavern feel like home, or at least the closest in home in a world where traveling meant risking thieves, bandits, or wolves. Some tavern keepers even became informal leaders, mediating disputes, lending money with interest that often made a bad deal, or simply providing a safe place to gather. And beyond all the drinking and chaos, taverns served a very practical role. They were information hubs, the medieval equivalent of the internet, just with more ale and fewer cats. Before newspapers or social media, taverns were where you learned who got married, who had died, which king was at war, or if bandits were lurking on the roads. Travelers brought distant news, merchants whispered about grain prices, and locals spiced up stories until a petty theft at the market became a barbarian invasion. Accuracy wasn't the point. Taverns were the heartbeat of rumor and news. Another detail many forget: taverns often doubled as inns, especially along trade routes or near markets. But don't picture cozy bedrooms with clean sheets. A bed might be nothing more than a pile of straw in a corner, a bench with a ragged blanket, or, if you were lucky, a mattress shared with 3 strangers. Privacy wasn't part of the deal. Most travelers slept in the common room, surrounded by snoring, coughing, or bickering couples. Larger taverns might have a room or 2 upstairs, but even those were shared, with nothing more than a curtain for a door. And housekeeping? Forget it. Sheets, if they existed, hadn't been washed since the last crusade, and mattresses stuffed with straw became a paradise for fleas. Smart travelers brought their own blanket and maybe a pouch of flea-repelling herbs, praying their roommates weren't too noisy or thieves. Legally, taverns lived in a gray zone. In many places, you technically needed a license to sell alcohol, but rules were often ignored, especially in small towns where the tavern keeper was friends with the sheriff. The church disapproved, of course. To priests, taverns were dens of sin, drunkenness, gambling, fights, and let's just say, other activities best left out of sermons. Yet taverns also filled city coffers through taxes or bribes. Shutting them down would have been unpopular. It was a constant tug-of-war between morality and money money usually won. Taverns also revealed medieval inequalities. Not everyone was welcome everywhere. In some taverns, Jews, foreigners, or certain professions, actors, beggars, were shunned or expelled. Women, too, often faced judgment if they entered without company or without being known to locals. Poor folk drank in shabby taverns with thin ale and scarce food, while the wealthy avoided taverns altogether, preferring their own halls with good wine and servants. If a noble or high-ranking cleric stepped into a tavern, it was usually one of the few upscale inns with private rooms and halfway decent meals. In many ways, taverns were a mirror of medieval society, its vices, virtues, and tensions all under one smoky roof. So, what's the truth about medieval taverns? They weren't the magical adventure hubs of movies and fantasy games. They were loud, dirty, sometimes dangerous, but essential. They were where people gathered, laughed, fought, and lived. No dragons, no wizards, just real people with real problems and plenty of stories, even if most were exaggerated rumors about a neighbor who swore he'd seen a wolf the size of a horse. So next time you watch a movie scene set in a medieval tavern, have a laugh. Remember that reality was rougher, smokier, stinkier, but no less fascinating. These were places where medieval life came alive, with its smells, its sounds, its chaos, and its characters, each one carrying a story, though not always a true one,